come to the sixth presentation of Hermetic America Future. This is the kind of illustration of esoterica that used to pass for the occult tradition. It is a pastiche put together by remnants of a medieval outlook. The so-called occult world is not the Hermetic world. The Hermetic world has a completely different outlook and look to it. It does not have diagrams of a medieval pastiche pretending to be ancient wisdom. It is ancient wisdom put into the future so that the quality, like in this great Hermetic American artist, Richard M. Powers is perhaps the most famous of all the science fiction illustrators of the late 20th century. And his presentation of future worlds that we will be able to explore and inhabit, we now already have explored and inhabited in terms of vision, visionary consciousness, and that the quality of man is shifting so that we no longer have an ability to go back to a medieval world. And so it is impossible to come back to a medieval pastiche that presents itself as if it were ancient wisdom. The future worlds that are already here in visionary imagination transform the qualities of the medieval back into a primordiality, which is the far future as well as the incredible ancient past. And our qualities as human beings have undergone a series of transforms, especially accelerated over the last 300 years. And since the turn of the millennium, not in the year 2000, but in the year 1991, the end of a very large time form came in 1991. And in ancient wisdom, it was called an aeon. The Greek spelling is the classic A-I-O-N, sometimes spelled A-E-O-N or I-O-N. A-I-O-N is the correct spelling for it. An aeon was a double millennium. It meant that there is a 1,000-year period, which is a pace, which is a cycle, and that paces and cycles always pair themselves because symmetry is at the root of emergence into being cinched into its existentiality. In order to be cinched, it has to be polarized. And so the symmetry comes because of polarization. But a polarization extends down to every level so that symmetry characterizes anything that has emerged into existence. And just as 2 millennia make an aeon, there are 2 500-year periods that make a millennium. And in ancient wisdom, they were called cycles of the phoenix. Every 500 years, a mystical bird would come out of South Arabia and go to the city of Heliopolis, the city of the sun, in the Egyptian delta, not far from modern-day Cairo. And there, at the Temple of the Sun, the phoenix would incarcerate itself into flame, and from that flame, from the ash from that flame, would emerge a new phoenix and fly off to the south again. At that time, in ancient understanding, about 1000 BC, that region was referred to as Saba and Sheba. Saba was South Yemen, and Sheba was Ethiopia. And the queen of that saddle-shaped kingdom that strode over the opening of the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean was overseen by a queen, the Queen of Sheba, whose personal name was Makeda. And it was Makeda who went to see King Solomon, who was a contemporary of hers, to try to see for herself if Solomon's masculine wisdom matched her feminine wisdom. And out of the balance, the symmetry of those two, came one of the most mysterious and remarkable books in the Old Testament, the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. What is interesting is that the male and the female, the masculine and the feminine, are also a symmetry in existence. They pair largely in worldly terms as polarities that cinch and create an electric field between them, create a magnetic field, force between them, but that the masculine and feminine in our species has the ability to turn the polarization and to turn it in such a way that it shifts from the polarization to a complementarity. And that complementarity is possible only when the polarization is equal, when it's equanimous, so that it is the perfect balance of a man and a woman of our species that allows for both of them at the same time to take the polarization and transform it into a complementarity. In this complementarity, then, their individual quality of existence interpenetrates in such a way that they now have a presencing together, and I have called this shared presence. It is the shared presence that transforms the ability for our species to simply be Homo sapiens sapiens into a new refinement of species of being able to be Homo sapiens stellaris, star-wisdom man. We live in a new time form, a new aeon, in a new millennium, in a new cycle of the Phoenix, where our refinement of species is now beginning to have a culmination. One of the triggers for it was the series that we did at the beginning of 2008, Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, how they are the originators of the ability to bring a shared presence, not only for themselves, into play in a cosmic complementarity, but to have it permanently open for any other male or female or shared presence pair, world without end. It is this quality of transform in our time which has a particular importance in the United States, leading before there is a change of aeon, before there is a change of that double millennium, there's a period of about 300 years that acts as a forerunner. It acts as an initial preparation for the ground to intensify its ability to open and expand into new possibilities. That is a field of vision that intensifies in the sense that it not only expands, but it increases in its fruitful complexity, so that it is finally, after about a 300-year period, the ability to have the change of time forms is all prepared for. Our Hermetic America began with Benjamin Franklin, who was born in 1706. And so we have had about 300 years of preparation for this new aeon, for this new millennium, for this new cycle of the Phoenix. If one goes back an aeon before Benjamin Franklin, you come to Alexander the Great. And if you go back an aeon before Alexander the Great, you come back to Sargon of Akkad, about 2300 BC. We have done a number of series showing that these time forms do not have a segmented quality, but they have an energy flow continuity. And the frequency changes because the time form renews. It is no longer the old time form, but something new. Two of the great events that happened in 1991, the Soviet Union simply collapsed, was unable to sustain itself, though it was one of the most sophisticated presentations of an old time form. It simply could not hold. And the United States found itself involved at the very origins of civilization in Kuwait and South Iraq, the first Gulf War, and many other designations could be cited. We have since then had a difficult struggle because of clinging to old time forms, old ways. And one of the newest developments is that since the early 1990s, this past generation has learned finally to use an expanded quality of language called the internet, and the computer has jumped in capacity, almost doubling every couple of years. And we now have something that is looming for next year, which will be one of the great achievements in the new aeon. This is from the Daily Galaxy, which is a net site, and this is from August 5th, 2008. The futuristic internet telescope will provide movie-like window on the universe. That we will have the ability for every cell phone, every computer monitor, to have instant access to a very large telescope. It is an 8.4 meter telescope, which is under construction and will be finished. It is in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile, one of the best sites on the planet for large telescopes. There are about 20 large telescopes in that region. But this one will be an access for every person on the planet independently to have instant access to the cosmology inheritance that is available to our species. You will be able, on your cell phone, to have a power of investigation and comprehension equal to the advanced research by any special group on the planet. This is a Hermetic American move. The sponsors for this were the Microsoft founders, Bill Gates and also Charles Simeone. Charles Simeone was the developer of Word as a program and of Excel as programs. Many millions, tens of millions, perhaps billions of people use Word or Excel, certainly Microsoft. It is a direct inheritance of the tradition that began to refine itself with Benjamin Franklin. We have shown several times one of the most beautiful illustrations. This is the world's first electric battery. This was made by Benjamin Franklin in the 1740s. He is the one who introduced the nomenclature of electricity, the positive and negative poles, the cathode, the anode, the whole quality of understanding that lightning was an access to a universal energy, electricity, and to be able to bring that electricity in a moment of non-crisis, in a moment of repose, because he was sitting in his own chair by his own desk in his living room, while the storm outside had a kite flying, and there was a wire coming down from the kite through an opening of the window slightly ajar to his house key. And it was the house key that was able to be hooked up to one of these jars. They were called Leyden jars. And the Leyden jars were able to store the energy from lightning. And by putting a number of jars together in a matrix, in a pattern, Franklin was able to make the first electric battery and to recount this in a series of letters to a man in London, Peter Collinson, who published them together in a book called Experiments in Electricity in 1751. This was the beginning of the electrification of the world. Franklin at that time was already 45 years old and had founded many, many developments. And today, Franklin continues to expand. What is important hermetically is that the spiritual person does not die, but that the spiritual person who has come into play in a prismatic way continues to live and have a future advanced expansion of their life and its meaning. One of the qualities of Franklin, if you go to the net, you can find two sites. Both of them are in Philadelphia. One is the American Philosophical Society. The other is the Benjamin Franklin Institute. For instance, the Benjamin Franklin Institute, just in the last couple of years, completed a replica of the Space Shuttle control cabin so that children and adults alike can literally play in a model of the shuttle control and be able to understand and feel tactically that they could run the space shuttle themselves. They could become acquainted with it. It is this empowering of not just the individual, but the empowering of the personal qualities of transform of an individual to not only have an expansion of themselves, but an expansion into communities of not just like-minded persons, but of resonant spirits. And so the community of Hermetic America is the fulfillment of what was in ancient times a special royal prerogative. The medieval saying is that the king must know. And so the king must have the wise wizard who informs him on the exactness of the relationship of man to the universe, of man to God, of the kingdom that he is responsible for to the larger kingdom of what is out there. The difficulty is that it was limited to the royal person originally, until a great transform happened in the time of Sargon of Akkad. It was the first time that there was an expansion of a kingdom so broad and vast that Sargon's Akkadian empire undertook to incorporate more than several hundred kingdoms into one large empire. But the most talented person in Sargon's time was his daughter, Enheduanna. She is the one who learned how to transform language out of its ritual limitations, out of its mythic centralizations, to open it up so that you had a different symbolic pattern to the entirety of it. She went to the 42 different temples in Sumer Akkad, each one having its own rituals for its own mythological godheads, and she did a special spirit transform hymn for each of those 42 and brought them together into an array called the temple hymns. And then in order to give it a new mythological basis, she wrote the epic of Inanna. So she is the first great author in world history, of whom we know quite a bit, and there are websites on Enheduanna, E-N. This quality of looking at the cosmos now is a quality where the masculine and the feminine work together. And in that cinching of the polarity, transformed into a complementarity, the central understanding was that the cycles of nature are first indexable by the moon, while the ecology that complements the cycles of nature, the ecology of the larger realm, is an ecology of the sun. And so the masculine tends to follow an annual solar ecology, the feminine to understand deeply the resonance of a lunar cycle, and that these two brought together then are like a presentation of something that works together and gives together a sense that now, with this as a template, one can begin to understand the stars. And in understanding the stars, the cycle of moving stars, the planets, originally 5 were visible. It is the cycle of the planets now joining the cycle of the moon and being able to be transferred to the sun that you begin to have the sense of 7 planets, 7 bodies moving against the stars, and that the synthesizing of those 7 is the sun as the center of it, and as it moves through the stars, it will have 12 constellations of those stars forming the zodiac, so that one has, in the beginnings of astrology that came about 2000 BC in Akkad, Sumer Akkad in Mesopotamia, about the time 300 years after Sargon of Akkad that Abraham was born. And so it is Abraham's time, about 2000 BC, that begins a new aeon. at that time, begins a new millennium at that time, begins a new cycle of the phoenix at that time. So that as that new aeon, that new millennium, that new cycle of the phoenix came to a fruition about 1500 BC, about 500 years later, one of the most powerful women to ever live on the planet became pharaoh in Egypt. Her name was Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut was the first to reunite ancient Egypt with ancient India. Sargon had had trade from India to Mesopotamia, from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean Sea, to the islands of Cyprus, and further to the west. But the links had been lost largely in the interim, and it was Hatshepsut who now renewed them in a very colossal way. She didn't just send a ship or two to India, she made fleets of 60 or more ships and sent them en masse to India, establishing all along the way the trade routes that 500 years later would be one of the most powerful sources of wealth in the world, so that the Queen of Sheba, coming 500 years after Hatshepsut, inherited the way stations between Egypt and India, because Ethiopia and southern Yemen were positioned in such a way that all the trade that was coming from the Mediterranean and Egypt down the Red Sea to that point, and then transferred along the South Arabian coast over and along the coast of what is today Baluchistan, partly in Iran, partly in Pakistan, to the Indus Delta. That quality of great women coming exactly at the point where time shifts occur. And a Diwana at her time, Hatshepsut in her time, the Queen of Sheba in her time, 2,000 years ago, was embodied with Mary Magdalene, one of the most spectacular feminine spirits ever to inhabit not only this planet, but this whole region of star systems. Extraordinary capability. We have in Hermetic America the quality of the last cycle of the phoenix that began with the Renaissance 500 years ago and extended from a particular point in that Renaissance, 1492, which was the beginning of the realization that what had been discovered, the new world, was indeed a completely new possibility for man. That the experiences of the past, however extensive and excellent they were limited to what was now characterized as the old world, and that the new world was available for a completely new quality. In fact, it's the plural, new qualities for men and women, for mankind. But one had to make a special shift, a special transformation. You could no longer simply be satisfied with experience. Now, what was important was to include, along with experience, experiment. And so you had the sudden rise of a capacity to have a science that was refinable and sustainable so that it would have an equal weight with experience, so that experiment and experience would hold together a polarity in some ways, but a symmetry in its deeper qualities and a complementarity in its deepest field. That formed a special lecture given by one of the greatest astronomers of all time, Edwin Hubble, for whom is named the Hubble telescope, orbiting about 380 miles above our planet since 1990. And it was discovered in 1991 that it was flawed, and so it had to be repaired. It had a misfocus of its telescopic eye, so it had to receive eyeglasses, which it did, and it was restored to being one of the greatest scientific instruments of all time. One can find any number of books on the Hubble, new images of the universe. And there are book upon book upon book of the Hubble telescope. Hubble himself was an extraordinary Hermetic American. He was very tall, and he was a natural athlete, and he was an original tough guy. He could have been a professional boxer. He could have been a professional football player. Instead, he got interested in being a professional scientist. But he was always the very tall Western man, meticulous in his dress, in his cleanliness, in his ability to maintain a stalwart dignity that was applied to science and especially to astronomy. Later in his life, he was born in 1889. He became one of the most famous celebrities in Los Angeles, Pasadena, Hollywood, Los Angeles. He knew all of the movie stars. He knew all the athletes. Everyone admired Edwin Hubble. And because he ran one of the most powerful telescopes in the world, the 100-inch Mount Wilson telescope, and it's a 60-inch telescope, and it's 150-foot solar tower telescope. He was always in demand to take famous people, celebrities, special people, up the New Angeles Crest Highway and to be able to show them through the 100-inch telescope what Jupiter really looks like, what the Hercules cluster really looks like, what the moon really looks like when you can look at something that has such a powerful focus that you could read the embossed lettering on a quarter 300 miles away. Now, this is an extraordinary thing because Hubble was the one who proved for the first time it isn't the moon and the sun and the planets moving against the stars in a zodiac that is the cosmos. That kind of destiny is like little sandbox understanding. All the stars that one could see would number about 6,000 if you could number them and name them. Whereas with telescopes, even little ones, all of a sudden there were not just tens of thousands, but there were hundreds of thousands. And Hubble was the first in the early 1920s to realize that all the stars that we see do not include certain clouds of light that were for generations called nebula. And it was Hubble who understood, first of all, that one of the most conspicuous nebula is actually a collection of stars in a galaxy equal in size to our own. His estimate was very low at the time. He said it's about 800,000 light years away, which astounded everyone. We know now that it's about 2.2 million light years away. And that our two super spiral galaxies have a whole cluster of other galactic bodies, about 20, 30 of them, and make a family, and that this whole family is moving in such a way that we're moving in a great universe filled with billions and billions of galaxies. So that Hubble, in 1936, publishing In the Realm of the Nebula, was a book that absolutely astounded everyone. And so he was invited to give the commencement address at Caltech in 1938. And the commencement address was so powerful that it was published later in the Huntington Library Quarterly in April 1939. The Huntington Library and Gardens in San Marino are about an hour's walk from Caltech along California Avenue. The article is entitled Points of View, Experiment and Experience. The ability to understand that when you have a symmetry of mythic experience and the historical experiment, now you do not have a polarity from myth and history, but you have the ability to have a complementarity of myth and history that has a new quality of focus. The focus is not just to a center, but the focus is a two-pivot quality that gives you not a circle with a center, but gives you an ellipse with a double center to it, which is more realistic. For instance, we know now that the center of stability, for instance, in our star system, is not that the sun is at the center, but that the sun is at one point of a shared center, and the other point is all of the other planets and moons and asteroids, and though they do not total as much as the sun, the true focus is this double center, making the planetary orbits not circular but elliptical. And that the true center, if you want to say, is in space in between the sun and this other gravitational focus. It would be the equivalent of being about several thousand miles above the surface of the sun. It's called a barycenter. But what's important is that the motion, then, of the elliptical orbits of all of the planets and moons in the star system give the star system a quality of special radiant dynamics called angular momentum, and also balanced by a centrifugal gravitational pull, so that you get a very dynamic, vibrant, living system, instead of something which could be diagrammed as esoteric. One has a complex symphony of special dynamics that have a conscious, spiritual, personal quality, as well as a cosmic resonance. We're going to take a little break and come back, and we're going to come back to two sentences from Hubble's Caltech commencement speech, Huntington Library Quarterly, which concerns why it is that theory is the originating of science and not diagrammatic, mental, medieval schematas. Science does not come out of the medieval mind. What science comes out of is the visionary field that transcends the mind. Let's come back and take a break. Let's come back to one of the ways to mark time forms is the appearance of very special persons. We talked about very special women, for instance. The quality of the ability to recognize a special person is to overlook the preconceived idea of an individual. A special person is prismatic in their consciousness and pragmatic in their natural cycles. For instance, someone who practices a yoga is extremely pragmatic in terms of their physical body and of their symbolic mind. And so a yoga is a direct, pragmatic approach to organizing the natural cycles. But anyone who is actually accomplished as a yogi is able to have a harmonic that extends beyond the physical and the mental, beyond the ritual comportment of existential postures and so forth, and the symbolic structure. And the first thing that occurs is a special kind of a space. And you will see it illustrated where you will have someone who is holy and they will have a bubble of clarity around their head. Or later on it becomes stylized as a halo. It is this nimbus of a special space that is generated by the sacred, by the person who now able to generate a sacred space acquires a holy presence. And so what comes into play then is what we have called the field of differential consciousness as a fifth dimension to time and space. That is not just another essential dimension like time or the dimensions of space, but is a quintessential, a fifth higher essential, and it jumps out of the order and introduces a new order. The easiest way to understand this, if you count to 10 in our standard numerical scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the next number is a 1 and a 0. The 10 jumps the order. Or if you have a scalar of the octave, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. The 8th note is at once the culmination of that scale, but is also the beginning then of the next scale, higher. Consciousness is a higher dimension which begins a whole new set. And this set, the higher set, does not go by cycles but goes ecologically. And its beginning is actually concomitant to the ending of the natural cycle. So that instead of having just a circle and then having a higher circle, they share a meeting point, but the meeting point that they share is a quintessential point of no dimension, 0 dimension. So that what you have, if you go into any kind of a contemplative life, if you go into a prayer living, if you go into a yoga, if you go into a meditation, and you complete that natural cycle, you will come to a point that has no dimension, which means that the single pointedness vanishes. When it vanishes, the vanishing of it completes that cycle, that natural cycle, but also initiates on the very next emergence the beginning of the higher cycle. So that when you want to symbolize the two together, you would use an infinity sign. And as the symbol for my work, I use a rainbow infinity sign. It isn't that when you get to the end of a spectrum that it just stops, but continues, and the 0 point in between the natural cycle and the conscious ecology. In the conscious ecology, the zeroness expresses itself as infinity. So that in any kind of a logical form, you can substitute infinity for 0, and the logical form will work exactly as airtight as it ever did. Now, this is a peculiarity to it. And the inability to be able to recognize that zeroness and infinity are indistinguishable in terms of any kind of logical form means that if you stick to a logical form as the criteria for your ability to experiment, to investigate, everything that you investigate will have presuppositions that already anchor it down to what it needs to be. And the presupposition that snags it most of all is the idea of identity. And one says, you cannot have a logic where A doesn't equal A, where 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, where 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. And in terms of a natural cycle limitation logic, this is precisely why a logic is necessarily insufficient. So that in advanced logics, when we became in the 19th century able mathematically and logically to think clearly, purely, abstractly, all the way through a logical form, it was recognized and realized over and over again that you cannot have, as a part of a logical form, its axiomatic beginnings. You have to have a completely auxiliary logical form to characterize the axioms before you can then apply those axioms and make an airtight system. And one of the earliest logical geniuses to address this in a poignant way was Lewis Carroll. And so he wrote a pair of books, Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. One of the great Hermetic Americans was Walt Disney, who turned Alice in Wonderland in 1951 into one of the really great all-time films. Alice in Wonderland, The Cheshire Cat, The Mad Hatter, it is an exemplar of why it is that when you go through the looking glass, identification no longer obtains. Identity is no longer a criteria because you have gone through the mirror. The subtle way, yogically, to express this is that the only way an identity can be maintained is if you close off the symbolic mind, making it de facto a mirror, so that now the mind's identification has a referent that is mirrored in the existential world. It can't possibly be real in terms of identification unless you can point to something and say that this is that. A is A. The one equals one, and that's it. Whereas when you bring into play, in a major way, the sophistication enough that that equals sign between those two is a delegation, is a presupposition, is not a part of the actuality, even in nature, much less in consciousness. And that whoever is making the identification, that observer, that mind doing that, skews the way in which it will only be recognizable in terms of its identification, otherwise it will be unknown. It will not be there. This posed an enormous problem in the 1890s because it was discovered in rapid succession that the identification referentiality of things has mysteries deeper than what had ever been discovered before. In 1896, a subatomic particle called the electron was identified and could not fit in because it was definitely not the atom. And leading up to it, the year before, 1895, were discovered X-rays by Becquerel in Paris. Some photographic film got smudges left in a drawer with a sample of radium. So that you had one of the greatest scientists of all time, Marie Curie, who went into this whole mysteriousness. What is it about the energies of things like X-rays? What is it about an element like radium and eventually uranium and thorium that they're radioactive? And why is that radioactivity of three types that they seem universal, and they have everything to do with electrons, with atoms missing an electron and now are ionized, have everything. And this quality of Marie Curie to be able to patiently, like a yogi in her laboratory with her husband, later on with her daughter, who became a great scientist in her own right. One of the dearest friends of Marie Curie, one of the few people who really understood her early on, was the young Albert Einstein. He understood because he also was working like she was working, only instead of her working in the lab, he was working on the papers that he was writing in his mind. And about the same time, they both came to understand that the theories that they're working with are not in the mind. The theories that they are working with are in the visionary field of consciousness, and that they do not take existentially because they're not limited to existentials at all. They, in fact, when theory as a differential conscious field comes into contact with nature, nature changes. It suddenly has different qualities it did not have before. It's like magic. In ancient times, it used to be called magic. We know that this could not ever have happened before, and now it happens. Something has transformed, something has changed. And not only has it changed the existentials in nature, it has changed the mind. The mind has undergone transformation as well. It is no longer purely an integral for the natural cycle. It does other things that it couldn't do before. What could it not do before? It did not have a powerful memory. Now, all of a sudden, one has the ability to remember in the symbolic structure. The memory was always fragmented before, always fleeting, but about 6,000 years ago, for the very first time, men and women became capable of exercising a memory, and as soon as that function, as soon as that dimension came into play, written symbols occurred. And the first written symbols were like pictures, and they were used in business. If you want to sell 10 goats, you want to make sure that these 10 goats are put on a little clay tablet and are passed so that you have a record that you sold these 10 goats and whatever you got for it is earned. Those little clay memo tablets were the size of a palm. And 4,000 years later, when somebody wanted to say that I have understood symbolically in my mind what has been going on, you clenched your fist, because that's like being able, now I hold the writing on it. I hold the tablet on it. This is it. It's not a black power salute. It's grasp. We still use the word grasp. One grasps the understanding and is able to express the understanding, not just orally in a mythos, but in writing in a transformed symbolic notation. The mind that can now remember, because it has a memory, is able to have written symbols that now the mind can read. And so for the first time, probably about it took more than 1,000 years for this new technique to gain traction. And by the time of Sarganavarkad and Eniduana, about 2300, 2350 BC, is the first time that you find written symbolic understanding expressed in a broad enough way that there are many people who could now learn to do this. They could learn to read and write. They could learn to access the conscious dimension of visionary differentiality and have it as another dimension of their natural cycle, so that the natural cycle wasn't just 4D, it was now 5D. But what came out of that 5-dimensional capability is the transform of nature into new possibilities, the transformation of the mind into transparency. One could go through the looking glass. One could go through the mirror into Wonderland. And so when we look at great Hermetic Americans, like Walt Disney, being able to take a children's story from the 19th century and 100 years later, put it into an animated children's version that came out in 1951. It came out at a special time where there was a torrential shift in capacity of people being able to use not just their memory and not just the imagination, but to learn that the practice of remembering is a function of vision. The practice of creative imagining is a function of the process of visioning. So that now one was able to learn what had been a very esoteric thing in ancient times: the gift of prophecy, the gift of penetrating vision to be able to see through something. In the 1890s, as soon as you had X-rays, as soon as you had the electron discovered, as soon as you began to have the quest for what is radioactivity, right away, what came into play in a huge way was that the limitations of our conditions at this time, in this space of this world, have an unlimited future. Well, where will it go? And the book that came out that emphasized this more than anything else was H.G. Wells' 1895 little novel called The Time Machine. But the biggest development of the time machine came in 1960 when George Pal did a film on the time machine. It was later made in 2002, again, not nearly so exquisite as George Pal, but in 1950, the way in which George Pal, who was originally Hungarian, he was born in Hungary, grew up in Budapest, fled, oddly enough, in 1930 to Berlin, and then quickly fled to the United States. His 1950 August, a reprinting of The Time Machine in Famous Fantastic Mysteries, a pulp science fiction kind of magazine, and these pulp science fiction magazines spoke a special prophetic visionary language to people of the time. And the people of the time were from the late 1920s to the late 1940s, in those decades. In fact, you can even pin it down. The first major pulp magazine was Amazing Stories in 1926, and the last pulp magazine like this was 1953. So that the science fiction pulp magazines had these fantastic illustrations of ancient things and future things all together in a visionary field that was like a theoretical field that emerged almost full-grown in the late 1890s. As soon as Wells wrote The Time Machine, he was approached to write another thriller like this because people were, the word at the time, gaga over this. His second one was The Island of Dr. Moreau, someone who experiments with what we would now call genetic mutation tampering, to take animals and to advance them forward so that they now became animal humans, and that the entire island was populated by hundreds of these experiments that hadn't quite worked out. They were half animal, all kinds of animals, half human, and that eventually one of the great science fiction films, the young Charles Laughton starred in it as Dr. Moreau, The Island of Dr. Moreau. One of the truly horrific films of all time, because they finally revert back, because in order to keep the animal tamed, they were put into the house of pain. They were tortured so that they would not regress back into animality. Well, the whole island takes over and puts Dr. Moreau into the house of pain and keeps him there. All of this comes as a great shock because the late 1940s, 49, and the early 1950s up to 1956, in that 7-year period, you had a sudden energy restatement of what was there in print in the early 1890s up until about 1906. In that period of about 10 years, H.G. Wells almost every year put out a major work of creative imagination that had to do with a scientific future based on visionary theorying of a human spectrum prismatic person who suddenly realized that all of these possibilities had never been talked about scientifically. You had the Invisible Man. You had especially the War of the Worlds. And in 1953, George Pal again put out his film version of the War of the Worlds. The recent Spielberg version of War of the Worlds is nothing compared to this. One of the qualities of Pal was that he brought out also When Worlds Collide, 1951, but his first movie was Destination Moon, brought out in 1950. So right at the split of the 20th century, one begins to see that the vision is beginning to broach not just a visionary science fiction, but a science future. And so Destination Moon is not so much a science fiction movie as it is a précis walkthrough of how it will happen. And how it happened just 19 years later for real, but was planned exactly at the time that the time machine came out in 1961, of John F. Kennedy calling for, at the end of the decade, to send men to the moon. What we're looking at here is that Hermetic America has a very special ancient wisdom quality to its theory field, evident in the prismatic quality of the persons who emerge out of that five-dimensional as a six-dimensional spiritual prismatic person, who is able to go through the mirror, through the limitations of the mind, who is able to go into Wonderland and not be nonplussed because it is, quote, illogical, or threatened because it might be irrational in terms of what we had understood. It may be completely new, but then again, we will be completely new and at home in the completely new. All of this came to a focus between 1949 and 1956, especially in that 7-year period. And anyone who was old enough to have lived through that could tell something was different, and the different year was 1950. The difference between 1949 and 1950 is a radical difference. If you want evidence for it, look to the children's comic books. The children's comic books of the 1940s were an extraordinary, visionary opening. The golden age of comic book superheroes. Late 1939 is when you had Superman and Batman. Early 1941, you had Wonder Woman. But a lot of these comic books were put out with a little logo at the top of them, DC Comics, Washington, D.C. These are American comics. It is an American visionary mythology that is meant to play out and develop new capacities of boys and girls. I will bring next week issue number 3 of Wonder Woman from 1941 and read you on the inside of the cover the tremendously sophisticated committee of people who were advisors on the writing of Wonder Woman and why it was necessary to bring her out to balance a Superman and a Batman. And as soon as she came out, Wonder Woman engendered a completely new form of a community, a collection of superheroes that worked together, and its name was the Justice League of America. And it came out exactly at the time when the spirit of Hermetic America faced the most devastating challenges of their entire history. a two-ocean war, a Nazi Europe and an imperial Japan. And the response was not one of fearfulness, but the phrase was, this is a can-do generation. And if the men are off fighting, the women are going into the aircraft factories and they will make the planes. They will make the tanks, the guns. And so you had this tremendous response from a visionary sharing of men and women. And one of the qualities that comes out if you look at films, especially American films in the early 40s, you begin to see that there is a different quality operating. Two films, one made in 1939, one made in 1941. If you look at The Grapes of Wrath, directed by John Ford with Henry Fonda, 1939, 1941, the first film directed by John Huston with Humphrey Bogart as Philip Marlowe, you begin to see that in just 2 years, there is a completely different quality. The protagonist in Grapes of Wrath, Henry Fonda, is unsure of what's going on and whether he can even meet the conditions. But he's going to finally try. Whereas in 1941, Humphrey Bogart becomes the cool, hard-boiled, genuine-hearted detective who will get through all of the complications surrounding the Maltese Falcon. And that even some of the toughest bad guys ever to hit the big screen, even though being pummeled and near executed several times during the film, he is still able to function and to show that all of this has been over a faux Maltese Falcon. This is not a solid gold bird. It's a fake. All of this has been because you have been pursuing to kill people over a fake heritage. It's not the real thing. And so you found at that time there was a peculiar quality to 1941. And if you're not old enough to remember some of the vibrations from that, you can go back and next week we will look and see. It comes out in Hermetic America in the science fiction. And one of the watersheds is 1938 when Orson Welles did a broadcast of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds over the radio, and tens of thousands of people rushed to get out of town because they thought it was a report of something that was true. Caused a great consternation. This quality of being afraid of the invasion of the Martians literally turned itself around by 1950, but already was there in the late 40s. By 1946, a young science fiction writer, Ray Bradbury, was publishing stories in pulp magazines, very much like these. One of them was called The Million-Year Picnic, which turned out to be the last chapter of the Martian Chronicles, published together as a book in 1950. From 1938 to 1950, all of a sudden you have a shift where it isn't that we're afraid of the Martians, but in the Martian Chronicles is that the Martians finally have all died off, and the Martians who are there now are those who have come from Earth, because Earth has destroyed itself, and one of the protagonists has his children look into one of the canals on Mars and says, "There are the Martians. We are the Martians now." This assimilation is a deep transform of the spirit. It is what I call Hermetic America. because what it brings into play is a primordiality that almost every other place in the world had lost. Why was it able to come back into play? Because the landscape is magical if you inhabit it in a visionary way. If you bring your differential conscious field into play in a landscape, its magical transforms will nourish you. If you go out to have a vision, that vision changes everything about the existential reference, everything about the symbolic limitations. Instead of symbols becoming referential identities, the symbolic mind now views them as something that can be looked through to more possibilities, and I call these transparent symbols. The ability to engender transparent symbols is the mark of the maturity of the species to a new refinement. The ability to be able to inhabit a magical cosmos of unlimited possibilities because we are prismatic enough to have the full spectrum of even impossibilities, if that is what is imaginatively called for. If that is what remembering as a function can do, because we can remember not only forward into infinity, but we can remember back to a zero field, the Tao, before any one existential emerged. And then comes a recognition which is primordial. Nothing emerges once. Everything that is existential emerges millions of times per time unit. That's why it's called a vibration. That's why it's called energy is a frequency. It can be measured. It is scientific. And that frequency is the way in which you have a sinusoidal wave of the peaks and the valleys that together carry the way in which an iteration, a vibration, a resonance will be the actuality of what is real. Our energy capacity is to be able to tune to every energy that there is. We are truly a magical musical tour of all the instruments, of all the musics possible. One of the great traditional forms of demonstrating this were the Mevlevi dervishes from Rumi's time about 800 years ago. They spin many times like an electric dynamo and never get dizzy. Hour after hour after hour, because when you're able to vanish into the pivot, there is no dizziness whatsoever. More next week.